Thank you everybody for coming today from all over the globe. So today we are really delighted to have Amanda Swearingen and Sam David presenting today. Amanda and Sam are in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. Amanda is a PhD student in second language education, and Sam is an assistant professor in that program. And today the title of their talk is Praxis and Ideology, Analyzing Teacher Learning in Translanguaging Professional Development. So welcome, Amanda and Sam.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks so much. I'll start with a big thank you to CARLA because we wouldn't be here without them. They funded Amanda a graduate assistantship over the summer where we did a lot of this work. And we're super grateful for that opportunity. Also want to extend a thank you to our collaborators in this study who were not part of that summer GA-ship and not part of this presentation. Some of them are here in the room, I think. Dustin Hemsath, Sam Ho, and Leah Shepard-Carey. They've all contributed significantly to this work. So the plan for today, I'm going to give you a little background on the study and what we did and why. And then we're going to talk about two analyses of this data that we've done, one of which is complete and is under review in a TESOL journal article, and another one which Amanda and I have been pushing forward on over the summer and ongoing. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we see on the horizon and on the close horizon and on the further horizons, and open it up for questions, hopefully, if we have time. So I'm going to give you a little background on the study, and then I'm going to pass it on to Amanda to tell you all the other stuff. In the meantime, the chat is open, and I'll be keeping an eye on it, but probably we'll wait to the end and respond to questions, but feel free to write stuff in anytime. So this study took place in the spring of 2019, and we offered a professional development series on translanguaging pedagogies at a linguistically diverse secondary grades 6 through 12 school in the Twin Cities area. And we invited all the teachers from the school to come, but teachers being busy people, a lot of them said, I love the idea, but I don't have time. And we ended up getting 7 teachers participating. We did 5 professional development sessions, covering a number of different topics related to translanguaging. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means for anybody who doesn't know. And over the course of those 5 sessions, some people showed up to all of them. Some people showed up to just 1 or 2 or 3. So we had 7 teachers total. 4 of them were consistent, and they became kind of our focal teachers for analysis. Our approach to the professional development was really rooted in a belief in collaborative PD, rooted in classroom enactments and opportunities for teachers to debrief. So every session after the first included time at the beginning to talk about what they had tried out in their classrooms. And then it would include some new strategies and ideas for them to think through, and some collaborative time to plan for what they might try out in their next classes. And they had a lot of choice in this. We wanted to present some basic ideas, a lot of different ways to try it out and enact it in different classrooms, and then give them a lot of choice and the opportunity to create kind of a professional learning community to think through what it was that they were seeing when they tried it out. Also worth mentioning that we got a pretty diverse group of teachers. You'll see in these slides on the left a number of different subject areas that they worked in, from science to reading to ESL to family and consumer science, which is colloquially referred to as the cooking class. We gave these sessions in January and February. That was the year that we had a whole bunch of snow days, if you'll recall. So we had a big gap in between, but sort of consistently every week to 2 weeks, we met with the teachers. So we had these sessions in one of the teachers' classrooms. We video recorded all of the PD sessions. We did not go into classrooms to see what they did. That's something we've done or I've done in previous research of this kind. So it was really teacher reported data as well as the artifacts that they created to see what they tried out in their classrooms. And we conducted exit interviews with our focal teachers. And just to kind of situate our thinking in translanguaging pedagogy for this, we've really been thinking with this idea of stance, shifts, and design. To back up a little bit, for those who don't know, translanguaging is an approach to pedagogy really rooted in the belief that for multilingual students and multilingual people, languages are not stored as separate structures in the mind, but are integrated. And as teachers trying to connect with students, it makes sense to allow them to use all of their linguistic resources in the classroom, whether it's a language classroom or a science classroom or any other classroom, and to create a real multilingual norm in classrooms, which is not an easy thing to do. Even when English only is not a policy, an official policy, it's sort of a de facto language ideology in most classrooms in the United States. So our goal here was really to push teachers to think about how they can make their spaces more multilingual and to how to work in spaces where kids are using languages that they don't necessarily know. This is the underlying question. How do teachers learn to do this work? So Garcia, Johnson, and Seltzer in their 2017 book, The Translanguaging Classroom, talk about these three important threads of translanguaging pedagogy. Stance being really dispositions, what are teachers' philosophies and attitudes about language, and the importance of giving students space to not only switch between languages, but also to creatively mix languages during learning activities. Design are the planned activities that teachers create to make space for language mixing, whether that's translation activities or homogeneous language groups to discuss literature. And then shifts describe the in-the-moment kinds of scaffolding moves that teachers make, because these translanguaging spaces are very dynamic and not very predictable from a design standpoint. So things are going to pop up and students are going to let you know that even though you thought that they were going to be comfortable with some activity, they're not very comfortable, or maybe they're more interested in doing something else, and you kind of have to learn to follow their lead, which can also be challenging for educators who are not used to ceding authority in the classroom and using those kinds of teachable moments. So that's, for us, describes, this, what is the goal as teachers move from first encountering this idea about a translanguaging classroom to getting to a place where they can really enact it in a robust way and be successful in meeting their curricular and instructional goals, while better meeting the needs of linguistically diverse students. With that, I will pass it on to Amanda to talk about the specific analyses that we did.
Thanks, Sam. So like Sam said, we really entered this project trying to understand what teachers were doing in their classroom and the way that they were cognitively negotiating their understanding of translanguaging and how that emerged in the interplay within the interaction in our PD sessions. And so for us, we really wanted to understand, well, of all the translanguaging strategies that we talked about, which strategies did the teachers decide to enact in their particular classrooms, and why did they decide to enact that? And then also what they felt about or how they reported the benefits and the challenges they were experiencing to enacting the particular strategies that they identified. And so we really entered into it trying to just listen and understand in a very locally responsive way to our participating teachers' needs. And so within this umbrella of translanguaging, the translanguaging pedagogical framework, we were really positioning, like translanguaging does, language as a social practice, in which language is really seen as a form of action that emerges within particular contexts. And those contexts are social and cultural. And so in this regard, all of the language practices that individuals are acquiring, whether these be standard forms of one or more named languages, dialectical variations, different ways of mixing languages, all of these really make up this diverse linguistic repertoire that multilingual speakers really deploy strategically in order to meet communicative goals within particular social situations. And so this idea of social practice is also how we conceptualize teaching and learning. And we think of this where knowledge and meaning are shared and developed and negotiated within interactions. And so teachers and students are engaging in developing new and common social practices within their interactions in the classroom. And we're also drawing on this notion of teacher agency. And so the ways that teacher agency is constrained and conditioned by socially constructed boundaries on what teaching is and what teaching practice can be is really important in how they understand the interactions with their students. And so teaching practices like language practices are constantly being reproduced and transformed through this interplay between individual agency and socially constructed understandings of what is acceptable behavior or acceptable teaching. And so even if teachers are inclined to regard student multilingualism as an asset for instruction, their choices are constrained by their understanding of the goals and the methods of their particular disciplines. And these are in turn shaped by their training and experience and socialization into their disciplines, as well as both school and district and often state policy. And so examining the choices that teachers make when they're presented with new ideas about working with emergent multilingual students really allows us to understand the structural constraints that are mediating their agency, as well as the new conditions for future action that arise as a result. And so we're directly exploring the design component of the translanguaging pedagogical framework. And translanguaging design looks at these particular three elements. One is constructing the ways that teachers construct the collaborative and cooperative structures within their classroom, how they deploy resources that are multilingual and multimodal for their instructional purposes, and then what particular or how they use certain pedagogical practices that draw on translanguaging. And so, like I said, we really wanted to be listeners and understanding what was happening. And so what we found is that teachers really employed a variety of both planned and contingent scaffolding. And this often emerged as requesting various oral translations of vocabulary, the way that they group their students in homogeneous language groups, or mixed language groups, their philosophies towards that, and how they encourage translanguaging during group discussions. That's where a lot of this translanguaging came out. And they also employed multilingual word walls and literature discussion groups. And we're going to focus in on these last two because they, for us, were really salient in our understanding of how they were negotiating this translanguaging terrain. And so for the multilingual word walls, most of our teachers, when they were trying to understand translanguaging, we're really looking at the ways that translanguaging strategies could aid students in expanding their vocabulary knowledge. And for them, the idea of a multilingual word wall, which was one of the things they were introduced to in the second session, I believe, really kind of aligned with that focus and their perceived needs of their students. And so for them, the multilingual word walls were a really powerful strategy because it really fit in with kind of what routines they had already established in their classrooms. And the teachers felt that the multilingual word walls really aligned with the curricular and school level objectives. And it was something they could immediately employ, right? Rather than kind of negotiating through all of the sessions of the PD, they could take something and get started right away. And so that was a really important thing for our participants. But what was interesting is they went into it with this idea that, you know, they could take their vocabulary and input it into some sort of online translator, and then boom, it was multilingual and they could put it up on the walls. But what started out as like their simple understanding of how to employ this strategy actually became this very rich pedagogical exploration of language, because many of the students' languages and their heritage languages aren't readily available in many of the online translators. And so rather than having these simple teacher-led translations, the multilingual word walls became an opportunity for students to engage even more deeply with content area concepts. And it allowed them the space to negotiate the meanings of key vocabulary. And they were doing that negotiation while using their full linguistic repertoires. And so the teachers reported that they felt that the students were generally just way more engaged when this was happening, right? And so we see this quote from Nicole, and this was a consistent sentiment by our teachers here. And she says, there was definitely a deeper conversation about what the word meant because we're trying to translate it into other languages. And so students had to really work to come up with these translations. And again, because of the lack of easy translations, what ended up happening is students got their families involved and in participating with the writing, right? So Nicole was telling us a story about a student who ended up using, asking their mom to participate in the translation. And so Nicole was saying, like, I don't know how to write it. I don't know how to write the translation. And so one of my students was like, hey, my mom writes it. So I was like, will she? So he took it home, his mom wrote it, he brought it back, and I just like enlarged it and put it on the word wall. So it became, again, these multilingual word walls became this very dynamic strategy in the classrooms. And lastly, they really let our teachers become more aware of their students' language backgrounds and their linguistic capabilities. They learned who had greater proficiency in print literacy in their heritage language. And oftentimes the teachers were really surprised by the linguistic dexterity their students were displaying. One particular example that I remember is Allison talking about how she was surprised when her students were using the English phonetic interpretation of Karen and the spelling of the Karen words. So again, there was just a lot of learning going on. But another strategy that was employed by one of our participating teachers in particular was this literature discussion groups. So most of our teachers, like Sam said, came from non-language content area spaces. But one of our participating teachers named Sean, he was the only ESL teacher who participated in our PD. And he was really already exploring the ways that he could create a multilingual classroom culture. And so he entered into this PD by saying things like, you know, I came into the PD already doing something in my classroom and I was looking for tools to make better. I was already engaged in the process of tinkering with something and seeing how different changes I would make I made would make it more effective. And so for him, he had sort of already gotten to the point of understanding the role of multilingualism that he wanted in his own classroom. And so he developed a system of guided reading groups where groups shared home and community languages. And he had been really planning this and was involved in scaffolding this approach to guided reading by incorporating translanguaging. And so he started by reading text and asking questions about the text, and he actively encouraged his students to use languages other than English within those discussions, and he encouraged them to use each other as language resources and as translators. He also incorporated in this model what he called language days. And these were days that were, or times rather, that were explicitly carved out where he required students to use languages other than English. And so for him, he saw this as an opportunity for learners to really practice both dominant and non-dominant languages in his classroom. He was really focused a lot on discussion skills. And so he taught a lot of explicit instruction on discussion skills. And he translated, he had the students orally translate different discussion stems that involved things like stating beliefs and stating opinions, offering clarifications, verifying, and disagreeing. And so he wanted the students to be able to have discussions in all of their languages. Sean was also really interested in what he called these fix-up strategies. And these are strategies that learners could use to really negotiate an interaction successfully. This sort of strategic competence. And these were things like circumlocution, approximation, translation, and the use of body language. And he had all of these discussions about these skills and these strategies in learners' multiple languages. So it was a very robust way of approaching translanguaging in his classroom. And so these were the things that our teachers really pulled into and held on to from the PD that they were employing into their classrooms. And I should say that Sean really was focused on language. As the ESL teacher, he said, when trying to figure out how to support my students, I looked at what things would help you learn language, period, no matter what language you were using. So the idea is that these strategies would help both groups, and by both groups he means English dominant and non-English dominant group students communicate more effectively in whichever language they are using. And so through all this negotiation, again, we were trying to understand the way that they saw benefits and challenges in the ways that they were engaging in translanguaging pedagogy. And overall, our teachers really reported students' greater engagement, greater positive engagement, particularly with grade level texts and activities. And let's see here. Oops, sorry, wrong one. And so Allison said things like, I think for one, students are just generally more invested when they're able to speak their own language, because they'll be more invested in their education when such a huge part of themselves is incorporated in the classroom. Teachers also noticed the benefits of translanguaging in terms of scaffolding and collaborative learning. And so they noticed this really increased interaction among students, and in particular, greater peer scaffolding that really fostered individual learning, as well as the development of collaboration skills that could be used in multiple contexts. Again, like I mentioned before, this negotiation of word meaning fostered this deeper vocabulary learning. And so we see here, Nicole says, then as we are writing or trying to get them to produce a written project, really giving that EL group more time to talk in their home language and then turn it into a written project. Even if it is, there are 4 of you and you all speak Hmong, okay, can the 4 of you come up with a final written claim and evidence? and allowing them to use each other as resources. And this was, again, a common sentiment that was articulated throughout by teachers. You have students that are able to use their languages to varying degrees, and they are engaging with each other to negotiate academic learning, right? And so lastly, one of the things that the teachers noticed is that, again, they had this expanding knowledge of their students, right? They began having, oftentimes for the first time, explicit discussions with their students about their multilingualism. And this really challenged teachers' assumptions about students' language and culture. And it led to teachers really personalizing and differentiating their instruction. So Carol captures the sentiment in this quote here, where she says, you know, the funny thing is, when I thought I knew something for sure in a language and culture, and I was totally wrong. So that really made me aware, doing one of the translanguaging strategies. This was really common because oftentimes the teachers had this information about their students, and a lot of time those records were incorrect or they were incomplete. And so just having these conversations was really beneficial for them, at least in the way that they reported it. But we also had here several challenges. As I mentioned, the multilingual word walls was so powerful for our participants because it was something they could immediately employ. And so one of the challenges that they really talked quite a bit about was this idea of the disruption of routines. And for them, enacting translanguaging strategies required introducing new routines and really getting students accustomed to new routines. So we did the PD midway through the academic year, and all of the participating teachers said, you know, moving forward, when you do this again, it needs to be done earlier on, right? Because we're in that planning process, and we need, you know, the students are already understanding what these routines are. And so it's more difficult when you have to disrupt routines in order to enact new pedagogical practice, right? And then another thing that was challenging was this idea of language grouping of students, or homogeneous grouping. We see here, Allison says that, you know, she got caught up in what do you do with students who don't speak other languages? And I feel like I never quite figured that part out. So I feel like, yeah, encouraging them to do home language stuff during Think, Pair, Share was fine for the people that don't, because they're still speaking their home language. But to do a whole class activity where you need to speak another language, I couldn't really do that with the whole class. So, you know, we had teachers who had, you know, one student in the class who spoke Spanish and nobody else was proficient in Spanish. We had teachers who had a large number of students who were English monolingual. And so the idea of what you do and how you navigate different language proficiencies and different language dominances in terms of student grouping was quite a challenge for our teachers. This also opened up the idea of this, again, language proficiency and the range of this. So you had students who had oftentimes very high levels of receptive language skills, but their expressive skills were more on the emergent side. And so we see here Sean also echoing the sentiment that, you know, learners were being tasked to do something new, and it created this sort of uncertainty in their own language skills. And he says, the reaction I'm getting from most students is, you're asking me to use what language? We don't do that in school. I didn't think I needed that in school. Then suddenly students are confronted with, you know, can I actually do this? Do I have the skills for this? You know, Sean was quite hopeful in his approach, and he said that I would hope that no matter what levels students are at, they can still participate and get something out of the experience. His hope was that everybody would grow in their language skills, even if they came in with very little. And so teachers didn't quite figure out how to negotiate this range of proficiency and sort of the emotional reaction their students were experiencing. We also saw perceived challenges in school level structures. And these school level structures really constrained teachers' ability to implement new approaches, like we were asking them to do with translanguaging. And so teachers felt compelled to prioritize particular goals that they're held accountable for. And these particular goals really took priority over any of these like innovative ideas that fall outside of these goals. And so here, oops, sorry. Nicole said, translanguaging can't replace my already very tight curriculum. So where can I use these strategies that's natural, what I'm already doing? It can't be an add-in, because if it's an add-in or on top of what I'm already accountable for, it won't work long term. And so this English only prevalence in their classrooms, and the way that they were asked to be accountable to English, created sort of this resistance to adopting translanguaging approaches, and in effect, the challenging of monolingual norms at the school. The next thing with regard to school level structures is this idea that English only is kind of the only pathway here. And so Sean says here, I can do what I can in my classroom, but if students go to a different class and the next 3 teachers they have are talking about how they have to use English, it's kind of like fighting a losing battle. And we asked him, well, what kind of supports would you need to feel more comfortable and more confident in doing this work? And he says, that the underlying message is always present, that you need to improve students' English skills and how they will perform on English assessments. And so he says, so I think there's institutional pressure to not only improve their English, but the idea that if they spend time using any other language, it's taking away from their ability to improve English, which is not true as far as research goes. So I think we need a greater awareness among administrators that multilingual students don't always have to be communicating in English to be making progress learning it. And he goes on to say that, we need to take it a step further by having the school acknowledge the linguistic diversity of its students and make sure that their languages and cultures are reflected in the school, and do this by encouraging teachers to make sure there's a space for language, multiple languages and multiple cultures in their classrooms. And so these constraints really sort of hindered our teachers' ability to enact more, it hindered their encouragement or desire to enact these more robust strategies when they have to think about all these other things and they're being held accountable to all these other things. And with the English only classroom systems that are happening in the school, that's where they're going to be accountable to their students, not necessarily in increasing students' understanding of their home and community languages. And so all of this really led us to understand or conceptualize this notion of entry points and trajectories. For us, entry points were teachers' ways of entering their translanguaging journey, their pedagogical journey, if you will. And how we understand entry points are these strategies that really help make content more accessible to emergent multilingual students by creating opportunities for them to learn using their full linguistic repertoires. It helped teachers, entry points really help teachers think more deeply about multilingualism, as well as the relationship between academic English and students' home and community languages. And it really creates opportunities for teachers to learn about what students care about and what they're capable of when allowed to use their full linguistic repertoires. So for example, teachers like Nicole and Allison, their multilingual word wall really became an entry point into translanguaging pedagogy. And despite being what we might consider a relatively simple strategy, for them, the use of their word walls really provided the opportunities to build relationships with students, engage their students in deeper vocabulary learning, and learn about their students' entire linguistic repertoires. But we also conceptualize this notion of trajectory and trying to understand or describe rather how translanguaging practice can develop from these early attempts with these entry points at enacting specific strategies to more robust commitments to translanguaging praxis. And so with this notion of trajectory, we're trying to understand teachers' growth in learning of translanguaging approaches. And this can often be observed through these sort of aha moments. And when we think back to our translanguaging pedagogical framework from stance, design, and shifts, that really helps us understand our teachers' trajectories and being influenced by their background knowledge, ideologies, and experiences. So I do want to move into this next analysis, and this next analysis is ongoing. So we're still kind of playing around with how we're thinking about things and how we're seeing and working and massaging our data. And so this is about the ideological tensions and teachers developing translanguaging stance. And this really came about because as we went through our PD sessions, we picked up on things that our participants were saying. Things like, you know, it really, really bothers me when we are asked to include multicultural, not multilingual resources. Also, you know, there were some kids that were higher with their English and I would see them helping and I was like, no, because they had to do a slideshow and it had to be in English. And the statement like some students are not proficient in their home language and not proficient in English. So now they just aren't proficient in any language. And so these little pops of articulation kept coming up and we kept like holding on to them. And so we wanted to understand, you know, when our teachers are getting into their classroom and they're trying to think about the way that they're employing translanguaging strategies, you know, what kind of ideological tensions are emerging in their negotiation of how to and when and why to implement particular translanguaging strategies. And so for us, we wanted to understand what those ideological tensions are by kind of mapping out what they're talking about and the way that ideologies are circulating and complicating their process of developing a translanguaging stance. So again, like I mentioned, this is ongoing, but we understand language ideologies as these beliefs and feelings and conceptions about language, language structure and language use, and how these are often tied to sort of these political and economic interests of different speakers. And language ideologies we recognize as mediating social structures and different forms of talk. They're informed by the macro, the meso, and micro. And they're also partial, multiple, oftentimes contradictory, and they can be both articulated and embodied. For us, we're looking particularly at articulated language ideologies because our data does not allow us to look at, we don't have the classroom observations to look at embodied language ideologies. We're thinking about this in terms of stance, which is our teachers' philosophical, ideological, or belief systems that they're drawing on to develop their pedagogical framework. And so there are these 4 ideas here about translanguaging stance, where language is positioned in a particular way, the nature of the relationship between students and learners, views of students, families, and communities, and the way that teachers perceive classroom spaces. And so again, we wanted to understand these language ideologies. And generally speaking, our teachers came into the PD and negotiated the PD with these ideologies of language affirmation and support. They viewed students' home languages as really important to their identities. and really try to encourage or at least not inhibit their learners' acquisition and development of their first language. This was again really tied to routines and how they were supporting linguistic diversity in their classrooms. And so we see Mark say, you know, I encourage them if they're reading and raising their L1, then their L2 is going to go up too. So if they're reading in Hmong or Spanish or whatever, I'm fine with that. And just encourage them and ask, do you have any books at home in Spanish or Korean? And, you know, try to engage them in that stuff. So again, there's this emphasis on trying to engage students in their own development, at least at home, right? We also see, teachers positioning their learners as their learners' languages as resources for developing English. And so for them, home languages have academic potentials, and you know, teachers really demonstrated this greater appreciation for the language prowess of their emergent multilingual students. But we also noticed multiple tensions that arose throughout their articulation. One of them is the way that they framed language. We have our participants constantly were using language that would position language as a resource, but also as a problem and also as a right. And so there was a lot of negotiation going on with that. And we see this here in these quotes here. So the first one is from Nicole from our first PD session. And she says, you know, some students are not proficient in their home language and not proficient in English. This is the quote we read before. So where do you start to bridge that really huge gap? And then in the very next session, she had watched a video about the term emergent bilinguals. And she says, you know, one thing I liked was calling students emergent bilinguals, because the end goal is for the students to actually be bilingual. So be fluent in their home language and fluent in English. And so again, we see this idea of language as a problem here in this semilingual positioning of students. But we also see Nicole saying that, you know, the goal is bilingualism, right? And so this is definitely not positioning language as a problem. And so again, we see these tensions here. We also saw our teachers, our participating teachers, draw a lot on transitional language ideologies, where they created, or they maintained rather, this diglossic positioning of language, where English is the language of academics and home and community languages are the informal, social, interactive elements, right? And so a lot of times their pedagogical choices reflected this ideology, which really prioritized the acquisition of English. And so here, we see this quote from Nicole, who says, with my EL cohort, they had to build a solar oven and they used their native and home languages. And then there were some kids that were higher with their English and I would see them helping. And I was like, no, because they had to do a slideshow and it had to be in English. And so the products of what they were looking for in their classroom were always in English, right? And the direction was always from home language into English. As Carol says, as we write lab reports and talk about something in the introduction and the conclusion, saying that in your home language first and then putting it down there in English is going to make a lot more difference. And so again, this transitional language ideology is really positioning English as the language of prestige and access to academics. And I do want to move on because we're pretty much out of time, but one of the things that Sam and I are looking at right now is how our teachers are not just negotiating language ideologies in how they're understanding the development of their translanguaging stance, but there are other ideologies at play. Carol, for example, is talking about how her students her English learners are the same as all the students. And so we get to see this sort of ideologies of what she views as inclusive education and equality that can actually be seen as sort of this erasure of multilingual lived experience. And for her, it's all about supporting the students and any students that need support. But it's not about language for her. So again, there's this mix of language as well as this ideology of inclusive education. We also have disciplinary ideologies that are coming into play. And these are ideologies about the nature and the institution of science, the teaching of science, and ideologies about multicultural education. And then we also, again, see these school level constraints where dominant language ideologies have really become sedimented, and teachers have to negotiate that sedimentation in their personal language, their personal ideologies, and how they employ praxis in their classroom. And so when the school is open as an English only space and languages other than English are treated in a particular way, it becomes much more difficult for teachers to negotiate ideologies that move away from assimilationist, monolingual ideologies and towards more pluralist and heteroglossic ideologies. And so we're left here with this, I'll finish here, this idea of trying to understand how that negotiation is happening. And Sam and I have talked kind of about, do we understand teachers' trajectory in their learning of translanguaging and the negotiation of these ideologies sort of as this continuum, where somewhere on the continuum entry points factor in, or does it become kind of more of this constellation where all of these threads are coming into play and we need to try to figure out how they're intersecting and how they're morphing around each other. So that's kind of our last, like where we're at right now and trying to understand how we're seeing our data and how we're seeing our teachers. But yeah, I think we will end there because we do want to open it up for discussion. And so thank you very much for listening to this long talk. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now.
Thanks, Amanda and Sam. Great. Yeah, great talk. There's been a lot of action in the chat. So I think there's some questions in there. And folks, if you prefer to ask your question with your voice, just use the raise hand feature in the participant window, and Sam and Amanda can go ahead and call on you and you can unmute your mic.
And I'll say, I noticed some of the talk in the chat and started to write an answer to the first one I saw from James. So there's a little bit more information about the PD. But some quick answers to some quick questions. Was language mixing encouraged among students? Yes, we were pretty explicit with teachers around the notion of translanguaging, not just as like a code switching between discrete languages, but also like creative space for mixing. But as I said in my response, I think knowing the teachers self-selected for the PD, they were already had sort of asset-oriented orientations on students' multilingualism, and we're really looking for strategies. And we were really looking to meet teachers' needs. And I talked about them having a lot of choice in their implementation. They also had choice in the specific topics that we covered in the later sessions. So we were trying to be responsive to them, and in that way centered design in our PD a lot more than stance or shifts. But as our analysis makes clear, I think ideologies are more complex than just yes, they are. Yes. They have an asset orientation, or no, they don't.
Yeah, and I think Corey's question after James about, considering how we're designing professional development, I think for sure there needs to be, and Sam and I have talked about this, everybody's talked about this, about having sustained professional development over a longer period of time that really asks teachers not just to negotiate the pedagogies, the strategies that they're learning, but also talk explicitly about how they're viewing language, and make themselves, somehow make them aware of the way that they're thinking about language, I think is really important. And so as we're designing the sort of the next iteration of the study, we're thinking about timing, but we're also thinking about understanding more of those school level structures that they're interacting with, by including data such as interviews with admins and other school leaders in the school, because I think, all of our participants said, oh, translanguaging aligns so nicely with the way that our school thinks about language. But then, when you dig down deeper, you see a lot of these elements of English only practice, right? And so, they had these light bulb moments that I think were very powerful for them. So I think it's an issue of time, but also exploring the actual context they're in beyond just their classroom, I think could be very powerful.
I'm glad you brought that up, Amanda, because I was thinking about that as you were presenting. All that sort of English only structure and the support of the administration. They had the support of the administration. The administration was excited that we were in there doing the Ph.D. But then there's these larger sort of policy structures. They're accountable for showing movement on particular metrics. And then they're busy. They're accountable for all kinds of different things. So if you're coming in and saying like, well, you're not accountable for this, but try it out.
Yeah.
No. To Christian, I just read your question. Super interesting. I don't think we did have teachers. The question is, did teachers express concern about coming off as less professional for allowing students to use their linguistic repertoire? And I think because they were supported and because they had an asset orientation, they did see it as something that was a positive for their own professional repertoire. It was more about but there were these sort of disciplinary issues, right? Like, they need to learn how to do X in English, and I need to get them there. What else? Yeah. I'm not sure if I can see hands. I don't see any up. So if anybody's got a hand up or if anybody sees a hand up, let me know. We're just reading through questions.
I think I'll speak a little bit to Christian's question as well, with regard to Sean. So like I said, Sean was our ESL teacher and had really entered into his classroom with this pretty well established translanguaging stance in his understanding of the importance of multilingualism. But for him, it was, like I said, if he felt like he was fighting a losing battle, right? And so even in those spaces where language is really the focus of the classroom, he felt like his efforts were sort of being crushed a little bit in a way by those school structures. And so I think for him, it was a matter of that, as well as overall the teachers' willingness to take risks in terms of their accountability. And I think where I kind of started with this ideology, the language ideologies, was thinking about myself and thinking about, my own views of language and multilingualism and the risks I would be willing to take in the face of such, of these structures, these dominant structures that we're talking about. And trying to understand, like, for me, I see it as, if I view multilingualism a certain way, I'm going to take the path and go, move forward with my pedagogy, even if structures in place are really speaking against that. And so I really wanted to understand how our teachers understood the ideologies and maybe ultimately get to the point where we can think about how these inform their decisions in taking risks, encountering certain systems that, aren't really all that accepting of translanguaging in the classrooms. And so I think that's kind of where I was getting at when I was thinking ideologies from the very beginning here. I don't know if that answered anything, to be honest.
And I'll jump in. I'm looking at Francisco and I don't know who, somebody else's question below that about does translanguaging pedagogy might promote language inequality in the classroom? I think it's an interesting question. I think translanguaging pedagogy is dedicated to combating language inequalities in the classroom in a pretty explicit way, although they can leak in regardless of the approach, right? And kind of in response to the other question about how do strategies change based on the larger culture, I think that gets at something really important. And not that there's one larger culture, but in doing this work, so much, I think it's so important to think about how it fits into the local culture and the local, I talk less about culture and more about social practice, right? So there are practices that are informed by, you know, the larger outside world, but they're also informed by sort of the local community and the way things are instantiated and the way things are valued. And because of that, especially pedagogies like translanguaging, which are meant to be responsive to the students in the classroom, there is no one size fits all, right? And there's a reason why we went in and we said, here are strategies that people have come up with. What worked, you know, you tell us what's going to work in this space. You tell us what fits in with what you're accountable for and what fits in with the routines that you're already using. And that's a very teacher-centered way of doing it. And then we're kind of asking the teachers to do the same thing with their students. And so that's, you know, from a you know, in trying to do research in an era of you know, scientifically validated approaches to education, that's difficult research to do because it's not something that can be easily quantified and controlled, right? You can't have a control and a treatment when every treatment classroom is doing something different. But you're not doing translanguaging pedagogy if every classroom is doing the same thing. So that's what makes it complex. I think it's what also makes it super exciting and interesting to work in this space.
So it looks like we got one last question from Yoko. So I don't know if you guys want to do it. This is kind of a complicated question, but maybe you want to just do a quick answer and then we can wrap up.
I'm happy to take it unless you want, Amanda.
No, go ahead.
Well, Yoko, I think this gets at the heart of what translanguaging is as a theory. You know, there's a lot of argument in the field about kind of how code switching maps onto translanguaging. You know, code switching is rooted in the theoretical commitment that languages are separate structures. And translanguaging has a real commitment that says, well, the named language is a social fiction. It's a political reality, but cognitively, it's really, you know, you just have all of these different linguistic features that map onto different languages, and you use them strategically. And if you're in an English space, you use the English structures, and if you're in a Spanish space, you use the Spanish structures, and if you're in a bilingual space, you might use both, and you might mix them creatively. And then that's a better description of what is occurring naturally in multilingual spaces than this idea of code switching, where it's a switch from one to the other. However, there's some excellent work, and Jeff McSwan wrote an article a few years ago that I think really tackles this question. You know, what do we do with all the code switching literature, which is great work and really important. You know, so sorting that out, exactly that question is what a lot of the work in translanguaging has been talking about for the last few years. So if you want to contact me, I'm happy to send you some references.
Thanks so much, Sam and Amanda. That was a really engaging discussion and a great presentation. So we really appreciate you sharing your work with us. And thanks to all of you for coming today. We know that you're pulled in lots of different directions and spending lots of time in online Zoom meetings. And so we appreciate that you chose to spend the lunch hour with us. And we hope to see you at another CARLA presentation soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.